You turn 19, and instead of a cake, you get a trash bag full of your clothes thrown onto the freezing pavement. That was Caleb Dawson's reality. With exactly $50 to his name, he bought a rotting, condemned textile mill. He just wanted shelter. He found an emperor. The bitter November wind sweeping through Oakhaven, Maine, felt like shattered glass against Caleb Dawson's face. It was his 19th birthday, though there was no celebration to mark the milestone. Instead, there was only the deafening slam of a heavy oak front door, the click of a deadbolt, and the sight of his belongings scattered across the frost-covered driveway in thin, tearing garbage bags. His stepfather, Arthur Montgomery, stood in the bay window, his face flush with rage, pointing a thick, aggressive finger toward the street. Beside him, Caleb's mother, Sarah, stared firmly at the floor. That was the image that would burn into Caleb's memory forever. Not the screaming, not the sudden eviction, but his mother refusing to meet his eyes as he was cast out into the freezing New England winter. For 2 days, Caleb existed in a state of numb survival. Oakhaven was a dying industrial town, the kind of place where the factories had shuttered in the late 90s, leaving behind a husk of unemployment, opioid addiction, and boarded-up storefronts. Caleb bounced between a 24-hour laundromat, dodging the suspicious glares of its owner, Gary Henderson, and the heated vestibule of the local post office. His total net worth was a single, crumpled $50 bill and a handful of quarters. On the morning of the 3rd day, hypothermia was becoming a very real, lurking threat. Seeking warmth, Caleb wandered into the Oakhaven County Courthouse. The radiators hissed with glorious, dry heat. He sat in the back of a large, echoing municipal hall, hoping to go unnoticed. Instead, he found himself sitting in on the county's annual tax default property auction. At the front of the room, an exhausted auctioneer named Theodore Jenkins was desperately trying to offload condemned, unlivable properties to a crowd of about 12 apathetic local contractors and penny-pinching landlords. "Next on the docket," Theodore announced, adjusting his reading glasses. "Parcel 402, the old Ashford Mill property on the Androscoggin River." A collective groan rippled through the folding chairs. Bradley Walsh, a wealthy local developer notorious for buying cheap land, actually laughed out loud. "You couldn't pay me to take that liability, Ted," Walsh called out. "The soil is probably toxic, and the roof is a stiff breeze away from crushing somebody." Theodore sighed. "It's a commercial industrial lot, 4 acres. Yes, the structure is condemned. The city requires the buyer to assume all liability. Opening bid is set at the delinquent filing fee. $50. Silence hung in the room. The Ashford Mill had been abandoned since the 1970s. Originally built in 1898 by Josiah Ashford, a reclusive textile baron who famously went bankrupt and vanished in 1924, the mill was an eyesore. It was a looming, Gothic nightmare of red brick, shattered glass, and a collapsing smokestack. The city was desperate to get it off their public liability ledger. "Do I have $50? Theodore asked, his voice echoing in the dead quiet. Going once, going twice. Caleb's mind raced. $50 was his food budget for the next 2 weeks. It was his emergency fund. It was everything he had. But if he bought it, he would own it. It had walls. It had a roof, or at least parts of one. It was private property, where neither Arthur Montgomery nor the local police could tell him to leave. Caleb's hand shot into the air. Theodore Jenkins stopped, blinking in surprise at the scruffy teenager in the back row. "I have a bid of $50 from the young man in the back. Do I hear 60? The room turned to look at Caleb. Bradley Walsh sneered, shaking his head. No one countered. "Sold," Theodore struck his gavel. "For $50. Son, I hope you know what you just bought." 30 minutes later, Caleb handed over his crumpled Ulysses S. Grant. In return, the county clerk handed him a thick, dusty manila folder containing the deed, a stack of unpaid tax notices, which the city graciously forgave just to get rid of the property, and a rusty iron skeleton key that looked like a movie prop. At 19 years old, homeless, hungry, and terrified, Caleb Dawson was the sole owner of a 40,000-square-foot industrial wasteland. The reality of his purchase set in the moment Caleb stood before the towering iron gates of his new domain. The old Ashford mill was terrifying. It loomed against the grey autumn sky like a fortress of decay. Ivy choked the brickwork, and the massive arched windows were entirely devoid of glass, resembling dark, hollow eyes staring down at the turbulent Androscoggin River below. Caleb pushed the heavy gates open. The rusted hinges screamed in protest. His first priority was shelter. The main weaving floor was a cavernous disaster of rotting timber, rusted machinery parts left behind by scavengers, and deep puddles of stagnant rainwater. The wind howled through the open space, making it colder inside than it was out on the street. After an hour of exploring the dangerous, creaking structure, Caleb found the old foreman's office on the ground floor. It was a small, brick-enclosed room nestled in the center of the building. Miraculously, the ceiling above it was intact, and a heavy wooden door still hung on its hinges. It was dry. It blocked the wind. It was home. Over the next 3 weeks, Caleb entered a rhythm of pure, primal survival. He scavenged thrown-out food from the back of the local grocery store. He dragged discarded wooden pallets and broken furniture back to the mill, using them to board up the window frames of the foreman's office. He built a makeshift hearth using loose bricks to safely contain small fires for warmth, channeling the smoke up an old ventilation shaft. But as December approached, the Maine winter bared its teeth. The temperature plummeted into the single digits. Caleb was freezing. He needed a massive supply of dry firewood, and he needed it immediately, or he wouldn't survive the impending blizzard forecasted for the weekend. Desperate, Caleb took a heavy, rusted crowbar he had found in a debris pile and began ripping up the floorboards in the far corner of the main weaving hall. The wood here was thick, old-growth pine, perfect for burning. He swung the crowbar down, wedging it beneath a thick plank. He pushed down with all his meager body weight. The wood splintered and groaned, finally snapping upward. Caleb reached down to pull the board free, expecting to see the packed earth foundation of the riverbank. Instead, his hands brushed against something freezing cold, something smooth. He stopped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He grabbed a piece of debris and furiously brushed away generations of accumulated dust, rat droppings, and rotted wood fiber. It wasn't earth, it was metal, adrenaline fighting off his exhaustion. Caleb frantically tore up 3 more floorboards, ripping his hands on rusty nails in the process. He didn't care. As the aperture in the floor widened, the object revealed itself. It was a heavy, industrial steel trapdoor, entirely flush with the concrete sub-foundation. Caleb sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. This made no sense. He had read the county blueprints when he bought the place. The Ashford Mill was built on a solid slab. There was no basement on the official records because the property was situated too close to the river. Any subterranean level would theoretically flood instantly. Yet here it was. The trapdoor was secured by a heavy, archaic brass padlock. The metal was green with oxidation. Caleb raised his crowbar and brought it down on the padlock. Clang! The metal shuddered, but the lock held. He struck it again and again. the ringing of steel on brass echoing deafeningly through the empty mill. On the seventh strike, the brittle, century-old internal mechanism shattered. "Oh, it's all eternal." Caleb tossed the broken lock aside. He grabbed the heavy iron ring of the trap door. It was impossibly heavy, fighting him with decades of settled rust. Planting his feet on the edges of the hole, he strained with every ounce of muscle he had. With a sickening crack, the seal broke. Caleb hauled the heavy door upward, letting it slam backward onto the floor. He expected a rush of noxious gas, or the smell of stagnant, rotting river water. Instead, a wave of incredibly dry, remarkably cold air hit his face. It smelled like ancient paper, machine oil, and ozone. He pulled a cheap LED flashlight from his coat pocket, one of the few things he had brought from his old life. He clicked it on and pointed the pale white beam down into the abyss. A set of perfectly preserved, reinforced concrete stairs descended into the darkness. Taking a deep breath, Caleb gripped his crowbar like a weapon and began to descend. 10 steps, 20 steps. The air grew perfectly still. When he reached the bottom, his boots struck a smooth, epoxy-coated floor. He swept the flashlight beam from left to right. The space was massive, easily the footprint of the entire mill above. Thick concrete pillars supported the ceiling, but it wasn't an empty, forgotten cellar. The beam of light reflected off something in the center of the room. Caleb walked slowly forward, his jaw dropping. Arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows were dozens of heavy wooden shipping crates, each one stamped with faded black ink. Property of J. Ashford, 1923. But that wasn't what made Caleb stop breathing. Behind the crates, sitting beneath a massive dust-covered canvas tarp, was a shape that didn't belong in a 1920s textile mill. It was sleek, metallic, and modern. He reached out, his trembling fingers grabbing the edge of the heavy canvas. With a hard yank, he pulled the tarp to the floor. A cloud of dust exploded into the air, dancing in the beam of his flashlight. As the dust settled, Caleb stared at the object, realizing in a terrifying, exhilarating instant that his $50 purchase had just changed his life forever. The beam of Caleb's cheap flashlight trembled as it swept over the exposed metal. To a 19-year-old kid whose entire worldly possessions fit into a single plastic garbage bag, the object beneath the canvas tarp looked like a spaceship. It was a car, but not like anything Caleb had ever seen on the crumbling streets of Oakhaven. It was wildly aerodynamic, shaped like a teardrop, and bodied entirely in bare, hand-polished aluminum that gleamed with a dull, flawless luster even after nearly a century in the dark. It had fully enclosed wheels, a split windshield, and a sweeping, aggressive grille that looked as though it were moving at 100 miles an hour, while standing perfectly still. Caleb slowly stepped closer, wiping a thick layer of dust off a brass placard riveted to the custom dashboard. The engraved script was still perfectly legible. Coachwork by Figone et Falaschi, Paris. Commissioned for J. Ashford, 1937. Chassis: Bugatti Type 57S. Caleb wasn't a classic car expert, but even he knew the name Bugatti. He was looking at a bespoke, one-of-a-kind automotive masterpiece, a phantom vehicle built by legendary French coach builders, hidden away right before the outbreak of World War II. It was a car that history had completely forgotten, but the car was only the centerpiece of the cavernous room. Breathing heavily, Caleb turned his attention back to the massive rows of wooden crates stamped with Property of J. Ashford, 1923. He grabbed his crowbar, wedged it under the heavy wooden lid of the nearest crate, and pried. The century-old nails shrieked as they gave way. Inside, packed tightly in dry, yellowed straw, were dozens of heavy glass bottles. Caleb pulled one out and wiped the grime from the label. The thick, wax-sealed top was still perfectly intact. The ornate, faded paper label read, "Old Taylor, Kentucky, Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Bottled in bond, 1916. Josiah Ashford hadn't just been a textile baron. He had been a visionary paranoid, anticipating the hammer of prohibition and later the economic collapse of the Great Depression. Ashford had liquidated a massive portion of his empire and converted it into hard, untraceable assets, hiding them in a waterproof, climate-controlled bunker beneath the very mill everyone thought was failing. Caleb opened a second crate, then a third. The third crate didn't contain whiskey. It was incredibly heavy, refusing to shift even an inch when Caleb leaned against it. He pried the lid off to find layers of heavy, waxed canvas. Tearing the canvas back, the beam of his flashlight caught the dull, unmistakable gleam of precious metal. Silver, rows upon rows of solid, poured silver ingots, each stamped with the assay mark of a private New York foundry from 1928. Caleb's legs gave out. He sat hard on the freezing concrete floor, surrounded by a fortune so vast it defied comprehension. A hysterical, breathless laugh escaped his lips. 3 weeks ago, his stepfather had kicked him out into the snow for eating too much of the groceries. 3 days ago, he had debated spending his last $50 on a warm meal instead of a condemned building. Now he was sitting on a dragon's hoard, but as the initial euphoria faded, a dark, icy paranoia took its place. Caleb was 19. He had no bank account, no phone, no family backing, and no physical security. The mill's front gates were secured by a cheap padlock he had bought at the hardware store. The windows were boarded up with rotting pallets. If anyone in Oakhaven, especially a ruthless developer like Bradley Walsh, found out what was down here, they wouldn't just steal it. They would likely kill a homeless kid to cover their tracks, and the local police wouldn't look twice. He needed to act, but he needed to do it invisibly. Caleb spent the next 4 hours meticulously covering the car back up with the canvas tarp. He nailed the crates shut, sweeping away his footprints. He climbed back up the concrete stairs, pulled the heavy steel trapdoor shut, and spent the rest of the night hauling hundreds of pounds of debris, broken machinery, and rotting timber over the trapdoor, completely burying it once again. When the sun rose, casting a grey, bruised light over the Androscoggin River, Caleb slipped out of the mill. Deep in his heavy winter coat, he carried 2 items, a single bottle of the 1916 Old Taylor bourbon and 1 solid silver ingot wrapped in an old newspaper. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to a bank. He walked 3 miles to the dilapidated edge of town, to a faded strip mall that housed a bail bondsman, a check-cashing front, and a law office with peeling gold leaf lettering on the window. Oliver Stanton, attorney at law. Oliver Stanton was a man who looked like he had been tired since the 1980s. He was sitting behind a desk buried in foreclosure files, drinking black coffee out of a styrofoam cup, when the scruffy teenager walked in. "I don't do pro bono criminal defense, kid," Oliver said without looking up. "Public defender's office is next to the courthouse." Caleb didn't say a word. He walked up to the desk, unwrapped the newspaper, and set the 3-pound silver ingot down with a heavy, resonant thud. Next to it, he placed the wax-sealed bottle of century-old bourbon. Oliver stopped typing. He looked at the silver. He looked at the bottle. Then he slowly looked up at Caleb. "I bought the old Ashford mill at the county tax auction 3 days ago," Caleb said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I own the deed outright. The county signed away all mineral, structural, and subterranean rights to me. I need you to prove it, and I need you to protect it." Oliver picked up the silver ingot. He ran his thumb over the 1928 assay stamp. His tired eyes widened. "Son, where exactly did you find this?" "In a place that officially doesn't exist," Caleb replied. "And there are about 400 more of these, right next to a car, that I think is worth more than this entire town. I will pay you 10% of everything if you help me lock this down legally before anyone finds out." Oliver Stanton slowly stood up, walked to the front door of his office, flipped the open sign to closed, and locked the deadbolt. "Sit down, Mr. Dawson," Oliver said, suddenly looking 20 years younger. "Let's talk about corporate structures." The legal maneuvering took exactly 5 days, during which Caleb lived in a state of hyper-vigilant terror. Oliver Stanton was a revelation. Beneath his tired, small-town exterior was a razor-sharp legal mind that had simply lacked a worthy battlefield. Stanton immediately formed an anonymous limited liability company, Oakhaven Holdings, LLC, and legally transferred the deed of the Ashford Mill from Caleb's personal name into the corporate entity, shielding Caleb from immediate public scrutiny. He then filed a preemptive, quiet title action with the state Supreme Court, a complex legal maneuver that forced any and all historical claimants to the Ashford estate to come forward within 48 hours or forfeit their rights forever. Because Josiah Ashford had died without heirs, and the county had legally seized and sold the property free and clear of all liens, the title was ironclad. But secrets in a small town are like water in a sinking ship. They always find a way to leak. It started with Bradley Walsh. The arrogant developer had been furious since the auction. He had planned to let the mill sit on the county ledgers until the city was desperate enough to pay him to demolish it, effectively giving him prime riverfront real estate for a negative cost. When Caleb bought it, Walsh assumed the kid would freeze to death or abandon it within a week. But when Walsh's connections at the county courthouse tipped him off that Oliver Stanton was filing high-level corporate protections for the Ashford property, Walsh's greed alarms went off. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, Caleb was inside the foreman's office, boiling snow over his makeshift brick hearth, when he heard the sickening sound of a heavy diesel engine idling outside. He peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. Bradley Walsh's black Ford Raptor was parked directly in front of the rusted gates. Walsh, flanked by 2 massive men in Carhartt jackets, who looked less like contractors and more like hired muscle, was staring at the mill. Before Caleb could react, the 2 men retrieved a heavy pair of bolt cutters and snapped the padlock on the main gates. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed his rusted crowbar and stepped out of the foreman's office, confronting the 3 men on the main weaving floor. "You're trespassing!" Caleb shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "This is private property." Bradley Walsh smirked, his breath pluming in the cold air. He looked around the decaying ruin with utter disdain. "Cute, kid. You're playing house in a toxic waste dump. I'm doing you a favor." Walsh reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled out a checkbook. "I know Stanton is filing some fancy paperwork for you. I don't know what you think you found in this shithole. Copper wire? Old pipes? I don't care. I want the land." Walsh scribbled on a check and ripped it out. $10,000. That's 200 times what you paid for it. Take the money, get a hot meal, and get out of my town before you have an accident in a structurally unsound building. The 2 large men stepped forward, cracking their knuckles, effectively blocking Caleb's path to the exit. Caleb looked at the check fluttering in Walsh's hand. $10,000. A month ago, he would have wept for that kind of money. Now it was an insult. He thought of his mother looking away as he was thrown into the street. He thought of the freezing nights. He gripped his crowbar tighter. "The price is $50 million, Walsh," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm. "And even then, I wouldn't sell it to you. Get out." Walsh's face turned crimson. "You little punk! Toss him!" he barked at his men. "And tear up the floorboards. Let's see what he's hiding." The men lunged, but before they could cross the floor, the wail of a siren pierced the air. Red and blue lights flooded the massive arched windows of the mill. The heavy rusted doors at the back of the hall slammed open. Oliver Stanton marched in, looking like an avenging angel in a cheap trench coat. Behind him were 4 heavily armed Maine State Police troopers, not the local Oakhaven cops Walsh usually bought off. "Bradley Walsh," Stanton barked, waving a thick stack of legal documents. "You are in violation of a state Supreme Court injunction protecting a historical preservation site. Furthermore, you are trespassing on private property owned by Oakhaven Holdings. Troopers, remove them." Walsh's jaw dropped as the state troopers immediately flanked him, hands resting on their holsters. "Stanton, what the hell is this? A historical site? It's a rotting rat trap." "It's a federal treasure, you ignorant thug," Stanton sneered. "And if you ever set foot within 500 yards of my client or this property again, I will have you arrested for criminal extortion. Now walk." Humiliated and furious, Walsh was escorted off the premises by the troopers. The heavy iron gates were secured with a massive state-issued logging chain. Once the dust settled, Stanton turned to Caleb, letting out a massive breath. "Well, kid, we did it. The property is legally secured. The title is clear. Now it's time to make a phone call." 2 weeks later, the old Ashford mill was surrounded by floodlights, armored transport trucks, and heavily armed private security. Inside the cleared-out main hall, a team of elite appraisers and historians from R.M. Sotheby's stood in absolute, stunned silence. At the center of the room, fully illuminated by portable studio lights, sat the 1937 Bugatti Type 57 S. Figoni et Falaschi Teardrop Coupe. Gregory Pierce, the head of Sotheby's classic automotive division, was literally weeping. It's a ghost," Pierce whispered, running a white-gloved hand over the flawless aluminum fender. "The missing chassis. We thought it was destroyed in a fire in Paris in 1939. The coachwork is completely bespoke. It's entirely original, unrestored. Perfect." He turned to Caleb, who was standing quietly next to Oliver Stanton. Caleb was finally warm, wearing a heavy, tailored wool coat Stanton had bought him. "Mr. Dawson," Pierce said, his voice trembling, "this vehicle, alone, will command upwards of $30 to $40 million at auction. It is the barn find of the century." "And the crates?" Stanton asked, sipping his coffee. Pierce shook his head in disbelief. "The silver is worth roughly $6 million in pure melt value, though as historical Prohibition-era ingots, we can fetch a premium. But the bourbon, over 400 bottles of pristine, bonded 1916 Old Taylor. The whiskey collectors in Tokyo and London will tear each other apart for this. You're looking at another $8 to $10 million. Caleb closed his eyes. The numbers didn't even sound real. They sounded like a different language. The ensuing months were a whirlwind that completely redefined Caleb's existence. The auction, held exclusively in Monterey, California, shattered global records. The Bugatti alone hammered down at an astonishing $42.5 million to an anonymous Swiss collector. The bourbon and silver brought Caleb's total liquid wealth to just over $60 million after taxes and auction fees. True to his word, Caleb paid Oliver Stanton a 10% cut, instantly turning the tired small-town lawyer into a multimillionaire, though Stanton still refused to upgrade his office coffee machine. Caleb didn't buy a mega yacht or move to a private island. He stayed in Oakhaven. With his newfound empire, Caleb bought out the rest of the defunct industrial properties along the Androscoggin River. He effectively forced Bradley Walsh out of business by outbidding him on every single county project, buying up Walsh's unpaid debts and leveraging them until the arrogant developer had to declare bankruptcy and leave the state in disgrace. Caleb poured millions into the old Ashford mill, but he didn't tear it down. He hired top-tier architects to reinforce the brickwork and install massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He transformed the upper floors into a state-of-the-art community center, a free trade school for the town's unemployed youth, and affordable housing. The basement, the secret vault that had changed his life, was converted into a private museum, preserving the history of Josiah Ashford and the town that had almost died. On Caleb's 20th birthday, exactly 1 year after he had been thrown onto the freezing pavement, he sat behind a massive oak desk in his luxurious penthouse office built into the top floor of the restored mill. His phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, though he knew exactly who it was from. "Caleb, it's Mum. We saw you in the news. We are so proud of you. Arthur lost his job, and we are struggling with the mortgage. We would love to see you and patch things up. We are family." Caleb stared at the screen for a long time. The memory of the freezing wind, the slamming door, and her averted eyes flashed in his mind. He didn't feel anger anymore. He just felt a profound, impenetrable distance. He didn't reply to the text. Instead, he took out a crisp, white envelope. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a single, crumpled $50 bill, the exact amount that had saved his life, placed it inside the envelope, and mailed it to Arthur Montgomery with no return address. He had bought his life back for $50. It was time for them to figure out how to do the same. Caleb went from freezing on the streets to building a $60 million empire, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the places everyone else has abandoned. His incredible journey from a homeless teenager to a town's savior shows that the ultimate revenge is simply massive success. If Caleb's story of resilience, hidden treasure, and ultimate vindication inspired you, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs motivation, and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.